I would like to call this hearing to order this morning. And before I make my opening statement, I would like to recognize Mr. Shimkus for a special introduction he'd like to make this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We want to always welcome all our guests who come to the Energy and Commerce Committee, especially those we ask to come testify. But I want to make sure I recognize my son, Daniel Shimkus, who's in the back there, and very humble. And he's been joining me this week. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me do that. And I'm going to take him to get a nice big omelet for breakfast. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, and we appreciate him being with us this morning, as well as everyone else in the audience, because this will be an exciting morning with Ms. McCarthy here, and we appreciate her being here as well. This is the 22nd day of our hearing on the American Energy Initiative, and today we're going to discuss EPA's greenhouse gas regulatory agenda. On June 19th, we heard testimony from a variety of job-creating sectors of the economy, and all of them expressed significant concerns about current and upcoming greenhouse gas regulations. As I said, we're pleased to be joined today by EPA Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation, Gina McCarthy. We welcome her back and look forward to learning more about EPA's perspectives on these regulations and their impacts on the economy and jobs. I would like to just make a couple of comments about the D.C. Circuit Court decision on EPA's greenhouse gas regulations that was handed down earlier this week. And I want to focus in on the tailoring rule. And I would like to make clear that the court declined to pass a judgment on the tailoring rule simply because it concluded that none of the petitioners had the standing to challenge it. So as permitting thresholds under the tailoring rule are ratcheted down in the coming years, it's going to affect hundreds of thousands of farms and small businesses. We had a witness representing the American Farm Bureau Federation just a couple of days ago who testified that farmers and ranchers receive a double economic jolt from the regulation of greenhouse gases from stationary sources. First, any cost incurred by the utilities, refiners, manufacturers, and other large emitters to comply with greenhouse gas regulatory requirements will be passed on to the consumers, and certainly that is them, because they buy a lot of products. And secondly, farmers and ranchers will face the distinct possibilities themselves of direct regulatory costs resulting from regulation of greenhouse gases by EPA once the EPA starts reducing the limits set out in the tailoring rule. When asked about the ultimate consequences of EPA's greenhouse gas agenda, Mr. Schaefer predicted that many small farmers may actually end up going out of business. And the American Bakers Association spoke about absurd implications of lowered thresholds under the tailoring rule and asked the question, would our baker tell a retail grocer to wait on filling a hot dog order while he applied for a permit modification? The bottom line is that the cost of any new overly broad rules that regulate greenhouse gas in baking ovens will ultimately force American families to pay much more for baking goods, and that some expansions planned by the bakers will not take place, thus reducing jobs that might have been available at this time when our economy needs them most. I'm also deeply troubled by EPA's continued views on coal and the role of greenhouse gas regulations relating to coal. Ms. McCarthy's written testimony today claims that the greenhouse gas new source performance standards provides a pathway forward for coal. But at the June 19th hearing, we heard from an electric cooperative who testified quite clearly that this is simply an illusion. Stephen Weinberg, the chairman of the Future Gen Industrial Alliance, stated that in effect EPA's rule will eliminate any new coal for years to come because EPA is requiring new coal fuel power plants to meet a natural gas equivalent CO2 standard before carbon capture and sequestration technology is commercially available. And I might add that Alpha Coal and Arch Coal recently announced mine shutdowns and layoffs in Kentucky. The impact on jobs is no longer a matter of conjecture. It is a reality for a growing number of miners and others whose employment depends on coal. Although EPA officials constantly refer to health benefits of their multitude of rules, they do not even consider the health impact on the families of the coal miners and others who lose their jobs. Of course, that's not surprising, since when he was a candidate for president, Mr. Obama, in a speech in San Francisco, said that his policies would end up bankrupting the coal industry. And coal is not the only energy source under siege. A small business refiner testified that greenhouse gas regulations would result in reduced domestic refining capacity, loss of high-paying manufacturing jobs, and higher fuel costs for the consumers. So we have a lot of concerns, even though this greenhouse gas regulation is not final, and I see my time has already expired, so at this time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for his opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I applaud you for holding this hearing today, especially in the wake of such stinging and stunning court defeats, undermining the argument that you and the others, the majority side, the other side, has been making against the policies of the Obama administration. Mr. Chairman, in this case, I am, of course, referring to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals ruling on Tuesday, which in a unanimous decision, the judges strongly and thoroughly affirmed EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Mr. Chairman, I would be remiss if I did not also applaud and commend Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation, Ms. Gina McCarthy, for the expertise, for the professionalism, and for the dedication that she has always displayed each time she has come before this committee to defend her agency. Although she is too much of a professional to admit it, I'm sure she must take a great amount of personal and professional satisfaction in knowing that the courts have, once again, validated the work that she and her agency have been doing on behalf of the American people. Mr. Chairman, in a resounding and unequivocal victory for the EPA and its regulatory authority, the Federal Appeals Court decision rebuffed industry arguments against 4 important Obama EPA rules. The court upheld EPA's endangerment finding, which established that greenhouse gases contribute to climate change and harm human health. The tailoring rule, which narrows permitting requirements to only the heaviest emitting industries, exempting smaller facilities. The tailpipe rule, which allows EPA to create carbon standards for light-duty vehicles, in addition to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's fuel efficiency standards, and the timing rule, which requires that greenhouse gas emission standards from stationary sources take effect at the same time as the motor rule. Mr. Chairman, in their arguments, the judges ruled that the endangerment findings and the tailpipe rules were neither, and I quote, arbitrary nor, I quote, capricious, while also declaring that EPA's interpretation of the Clean Air Act was, and again, I quote, unambiguously correct, end of quote. And to the chagrin and contrary decisions of the waves of witnesses that have come before this subcommittee, the court also found that industry petitioners had no standing to challenge the timing and tailoring rules because these rules would, in fact, benefit rather than harm them. Mr. Chairman, today's decision, or Tuesday's decision rather, simply confirms the Supreme Court's 2007 Massachusetts versus the EPA ruling that the agency does have the right, and indeed does have the obligation, to regulate carbon, since greenhouse gas emissions meet the definition of a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. Despite the talking points that we've heard time upon time, countless times, from industry representatives appearing before this subcommittee, hopefully, prayerfully, Tuesday's Federal Appeals Court ruling to uphold EPA's basis for regulating greenhouse gas emissions has deprived the majority party and their industry allies of many of their most often repeated arguments against EPA climate regulation. Mr. Chairman, I hope that Tuesday's decision will spur the majority party to work with our side to find constructive ways to strengthen the provisions of the Clean Air Act and to find collaborative ways to address legitimate concerns where they may exist. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry to hear the statement about people losing their jobs in the coal industry. I know that is very difficult for those people and their families. But I would respectfully submit that if they're losing their jobs, it's not because of regulation. It's primarily because they're not able to compete in the marketplace where natural gas is cheaper. But today's hearing continues the 18-month Republican attack on the Clean Air Act, EPA regulations, and the science that informs our understanding of the effects of air pollution. The House Republicans have made this the most anti-environment House in history. To date, the Republicans have voted more than 270 times on the House floor to weaken long-standing public health and environmental laws, block environmental regulations, defund environmental protections, and oppose clean energy. The most shameful aspect of this anti-environment campaign is the denial of science. There is no way to govern responsibly if you refuse to accept the findings of the National Academy of Sciences and the rest of the scientific community. Yes, yet that's what's happening on this committee. Here's what one of the world's preeminent science journals, Nature, wrote about this committee's votes to deny the existence of climate change. Quote, "It is hard to escape the conclusion that the U.S. Congress has entered the intellectual wilderness, a sad state of affairs in a country that has led the world in many scientific arenas for so long. Misinformation was presented as fact, truth was twisted, and nobody showed any inclination to listen to scientists, let alone learn from them. It has been an embarrassing display, not just for the Republican Party, but also for Congress," end quote. This willful blindness may enrich oil companies and other big polluters, but it is reckless and it is dangerous. And I would submit that the coal industry is going to suffer even more because they're not willing to work with us to try to find a way to make coal a viable option in our energy portfolio by figuring out the technology to remove the carbon emissions. All you need to do, if you doubt my concerns about paying attention to science, is just turn on the news. Wildfires are burning hundreds of homes in Colorado. Rains are flooding Florida. These extreme weather events will become more common as we deny the science and pretend we can ignore the laws of nature. Earlier this week, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals provided a refreshing dose of reality. In a unanimous decision, which included Reagan-appointed Chief Judge Sentelle, The panel dismissed all the challenges to EPA's endangerment finding, tailpipe standards for greenhouse gases, and tailoring rule. House Republicans have said over and over again that EPA is acting without congressional authorization. Here's what the court said about that. EPA's interpretation of the governing Clear Act provisions is, quote, unambiguously correct, end quote. This decision was a huge victory for science. The court dismissed every challenge to the adequacy of the scientific record supporting the finding that greenhouse gases endanger public health and the environment. The court found that an ocean of evidence, that's in quotes because that's their term, supported EPA's findings, and it held that EPA was right to rely on the work of the National Academy of Sciences and other authoritative bodies, writing, quote, "This is how science works. EPA is not required to prove the existence of the atom," end quote. Today we'll hear from Gina McCarthy, who runs the air program at EPA. As the court recognized, she and her agency are acting responsibly. They are listening to scientific experts. They're crafting responsible policies. Yet all this committee tries to do is throw sand in the gears. Our record is a deplorable one of denial and obstructionism. The question we should be asking is not what we can do to stop reasonable regulation, but how we can help the families whose homes are being burned in Colorado Springs and flooded in St. Petersburg, and how we can help the families who are losing jobs in the coal industry, because that industry is refusing to recognize reality. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. At this time, I'd like to recognize Ms. McCarthy and thank you very much for joining us today. And you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and other members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on EPA's efforts to reduce carbon pollution under the Clean Air Act. The Supreme Court held in 2007 that greenhouse gases are covered by the Clean Air Act's broad definition of air pollutants. Just this week, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit confirmed that EPA followed both the science and the law in issuing the endangerment finding for greenhouse gases and in proceeding to take common sense actions to address carbon pollution from vehicles and other large sources. The court found, and I quote, that the body of scientific evidence marshaled by EPA in support of the endangerment finding is substantial, end quote. The court confirmed that the Clean Air Act required EPA to set greenhouse gas standards for cars and light-duty trucks, and that the Act unambiguously requires application of stationary source permitting programs to greenhouse gases. Finally, the court ruled that EPA's tailoring rule alleviates burden on industry in the states, and they dismissed all challenges to that rule. Reducing greenhouse gas pollution is critically important to the protection of Americans' public health and the environment upon which we depend. As the court underscored, there is abundant scientific evidence that the Earth is warming, that anthropogenic carbon pollution is largely responsible for that warming, and that if climate change goes unchecked, it could have devastating impacts on the United States and this planet. Climate change resulting from carbon pollution is leading to more frequent and intense heat waves and is projected to increase ozone pollution over broad areas. It's expected to lead to sea level rise, more intense hurricanes and storms, heavier and more frequent flooding, increased drought, and more severe wildfires, events that can cause deaths, injuries, and billions of dollars of damage to property and the nation's infrastructure. Some of these impacts already have been observed. EPA's first step to reduce harmful greenhouse gas pollution have begun with motor vehicles, which are responsible for nearly a fourth of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. At President Obama's direction, EPA and the National Highway and Traffic Safety Administration have worked together to set greenhouse gas and fuel economy standards for model years 2012 to 2016 passenger vehicles and to propose standards for model years 2017 to 2025. Over the life of these vehicles, these standards will save an estimated $1.7 trillion for consumers and businesses and cut America's oil consumption by 12 billion barrels, while they reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 6 billion metric tons. EPA and NHTSA's standards for heavy-duty trucks and buses, which were issued in August 2011, present a similar success story, which is outlined in my written testimony. In January 2011, states and EPA initiated Clean Air Act permitting of greenhouse gas pollution from the largest and new and modified stationary sources. EPA's tailoring rule, upheld by the court this week, phases in these permitting requirements by focusing on large industrial sources. To date, dozens of large facilities, such as cement plants, power plants, refineries, and steel mills, have already received permits for greenhouse gases. On March 27, 2012, EPA proposed a carbon pollution standard for new power plants. Power plants represent the single largest source of industrial greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, accounting for approximately 40% of U.S. CO2 emissions. EPA's proposed new standards for power plants, just new power plants, could be met by current natural gas combined cycle units or by units that are fueled by coal or petroleum coke that use carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS. The nation's electricity comes from diverse and largely domestic energy sources, including coal, natural gas, nuclear, and increasingly renewable energy sources. The proposed standard that we have put on the table for public comment does not change that fact. It reflects the ongoing trend in the power sector to build cleaner power plants while providing a path forward for coal with CCS. Over the past 3 years, EPA has proceeded in a careful and deliberate manner to address carbon pollution under the Clean Air Act, consistent with the resounding body of science as well as the law. Our experience during more than 40 years of Clean Air Act implementation is that pollution reduction and a healthy economy go hand in hand. Together with other policies, Clean Air Act measures to reduce carbon pollution can combat harmful climate change, while at the same time supporting a transition to a cleaner, more efficient, and more prosperous energy future. Again, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ms. McCarthy. Ms. McCarthy, you testified here on March 28th, and you testified that you made the comment that the EPA rules really were not a major factor on coal plants because coal plants were not going to be built anyway. And Mr. Pompeo asked you the question, he asked, is that your theory? Do you actually believe that? And you said, that isn't my theory. That is an analysis by the Energy Information Office and the EIA. They are the ones that have done modeling, that took a look at what power plants are being constructed, and et cetera. And then just a few minutes ago, Mr. Waxman made the comment that that the coal areas are not facing reality. He said they're not being built because of market forces, and that that natural gas prices are so low. And we recognize that natural gas prices are very low. But the CBO, on a most recent study, indicated quite clearly that in addition, that one of the major factors relating to the lack of building additional coal plants was about environmental regulations, and they specifically talk about greenhouse gases. And then in addition to that, you had referred to EIA, that it was that they were the ones saying that we were not going to be building additional coal plants because of natural gas prices. In EIA's most recent report, they said, in the absence of greenhouse gas policies, there would be 40 gigawatts of new coal-fired capacity built from 2011 to 2035. So my point is this. I've had a real problem with EPA. I know that you're doing your job, you're trying to meet the requirements, but you all continue to mislead the American people. Sure, natural gas prices is one factor, but I don't know how you possibly deny that these regulations, the Utility MAC, the Cross-State Air Transport Rule, the Boiler MAC, the greenhouse gas regulations, all of these, the multitude, how can you say that they're not having an impact on coal being competitive in the global marketplace and in the marketplace in the United States?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that EPA in my statements have been consistent in saying that we understand that there is a market shift in the energy world. We understand that there is inexpensive natural gas.
Why?
Because there is inexpensive natural gas.
And what else?
Low energy demand. No one has ever denied that our regulations aren't a factor in decision.
They are a factor. You accept that they are a factor.
However,
okay. That's what I wanted to hear. Now, another example. Let me just give you another example. When you all passed the Utility MAC,
yes,
you refer to it as mercury and air toxics
yes,
standards.
yes.
And we've talked about this before, but that was sold on the basis that mercury emissions were going to be the primary benefit. There would be benefits because of mercury emissions. And all of the analysis, your analysis, independent analysis, showed that the primary benefit came from reduction of particulate matter, not mercury emissions. And every time we had a hearing up here, our friends on the other side of the aisle specifically talked about, oh my gosh, we're going to, the benefits from mercury reduction. And my whole point is that is misleading the American people. Sure, there were benefits from Utility MAC or mercury and air toxic standards, but the primary benefit was not mercury reductions. Would you agree with that?
No, I would not, sir.
Your own analysis said that.
What I would indicate to you is that rule was to follow the Clean Air Act and to regulate a major source of toxic pollution. We regulated those toxics. As part of that, it required controls that would also reduce particulate matter.
Yeah, but your own analysis indicate that the primary benefit came not from mercury reduction, but particulate matter reduction.
The distinction I'm trying to make, sir, is that the primary benefit that we're able to capture through cost benefit is particulate matter. That does not mean that there isn't significant public health benefit associated with reducing toxins.
But it was sold based on mercury reduction. That's what everybody talked about.
That is
my time has expired, and at this time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
Assistant Administrator McCarthy, I want to thank you for being here today, and as I stated in my opening statement, I want to thank you for being a true professional each time you've been called to appear before this subcommittee. And despite the bullying and the criticism that you personally experienced and the vicious attacks against the agency that you represent, you have maintained your composure, your professionalism, and have continued to faithfully execute the duties of your office. And I commend you and all of your colleagues over at the EPA for continuing to stand up for millions of Americans who might not have the money nor the political influence that industry have, but who still expect for their rights and their interests to be protected. So again, I applaud you, and I'm eager to hear what you have to say on the implications of Tuesday's federal court rulings. And for the record, could you please inform the subcommittee on the most important points of the Federal Appeals Court ruling, especially as it relates to the charges you've heard countless times that EPA, here in this subcommittee, that the EPA is overreaching and exceeding its authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act?
I'd be happy to. First, thank you for your kind words. I consider it a privilege to be here. I would perhaps like to be less privileged at times, but it's wonderful to be here. And I have great respect for this body, so thank you very much.
Yes.
In answer to your question, the court made some tremendous statements in support of the substance of the evidence and the science that underpinned EPA's decision that carbon pollution represents a significant threat to public health and welfare in this country. It overwhelmingly said that EPA was following the Clean Air Act when it indicated that the light-duty vehicle rule also that carbon pollution from light-duty vehicle rules contribute. And as soon as we made that determination, we moved forward with the rules that the Clean Air Act did require us to then look at the permitting of stationary sources. It also indicated that when we did that and we phased that in a common sense way, just focused on the largest sources, and we took a very deliberate and phased approach to looking at how we would address any smaller sources. It said that that rule did not impose burdens on industry or states, and in fact, it was a deregulation, and it dismissed all of those charges. So it's, in essence, provided tremendous support that we were both following the law and the science, which is our jobs and what Congress asked EPA and authorized and required us to do.
Thank you. I again know that it was a resounding statement of support for your past activities. Can you explain how this decision impacts EPA's work moving forward, or will it have any effect on your work as you move forward?
EPA has designed a strategy which continues to be a deliberate common sense approach to regulating carbon pollution, which is necessary to protect public health and welfare. But we have found a way to do that in a way that, again, just focuses on the largest sources. And I think we have shown that time and time again, not only in how we're issuing permits in a timely way under the tailoring rule, and how we have moved forward with the greenhouse gas new source performance standard that just addresses new power plants, and in a way that we can make it consistent with the direction of the energy market and with the movement towards clean energy.
Yeah. Ms. McCarthy, you have been under some pretty relentless attacks for, it seems to me, if I could characterize the attitudes of someone on the other side, that you are a hater of the coal industry. How would you respond to those accusations that you are a hater or you are anti, that you hate the coal industry?
I would say that EPA, our job and my job in particular, is to look at how we can reduce air pollution that poses significant threats to public health and welfare. We have done that in a way that doesn't single out any fuel supply. It is a fuel neutral response. If you look at how we have developed the carbon pollution standards for new power plants, we recognized that that a standard could be established that would accommodate the vast majority of new power plants that are being constructed today and wouldn't pose a significant lowering of the standard than they're able to achieve, and they've been able to achieve since 2005. And we also established an alternative compliance pathway, recognizing that coal is a significant source of energy in this country now, and it will be in the foreseeable future. And we needed to understand that and provide an opportunity for new coal facilities, as long as they looked at the most innovative and cost-effective, technologies available to that, and over time found a cost-effective strategy to achieve that standard. So we have done everything we could to design our rules, recognizing that there's fuel diversity and protecting that fuel diversity moving forward.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time I'd like to recognize Mr. Terry, gentleman from Nebraska, for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman, and first I just want to say that I support clean coal technologies. I'm a little frustrated that we haven't had the pilot rollouts and more permits issued for clean coal. We had a hearing one time about how China's able to do it, and even the minority's own witness agreed that in China they don't have the regulatory burdens and pathways to get a clean coal facility built. But we have to have coal as part of our portfolio. But there does, with the myriad of rules that have come out that seem to all flow towards controlling emissions from coal-fired plants and then the coal ash on top of it, there does appear to be a war on coal, and you combine that with statements made by both the president when he was running and others that are in the administration that seem to agree with some of the environmental groups like the Sierra Club that want to see all coal use ended. So that's, if there's a perception there, there is a perception there whether the EPA wants to recognize it or not. And I don't think that's bullying, by the way, pointing that out. If I'm bullying you right now, would you please let me know?
Congressman, you have never, and I don't expect you would. I'll let
Thank
you know
you.
if you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And another area that I think is important is reducing emissions from autos. And that's why I did the Terry Hill bill in '07. Of course, that was then worked with environmental groups, John Dingell, Nancy Pelosi. We were able to get that into the '07 bill. The president took it upon himself to make some significant changes to that. But nonetheless, philosophically, we're in agreement. If we can reduce auto emissions, we should. In fact, I drive a Ford hybrid Fusion. I get about 39, sometimes 40, depending on whether it's winter or summer, about 40 miles per gallon and about 600 per tank fill. I love that. To me, that's sticking it to the man. But I do have to wonder if the 2025 standards that are part of this discussion today are achievable without significant changes in the industry and usage, and whether some of the claims like $8,200 in savings is really accurate that's on, and I'm going to submit this for the record. I think you've already mentioned this. This is on the whitehouse.gov, about $1.7 trillion. So my first question is on savings of $3,000 or $8,000 for a fuel savings cost of $8,000 for a 2025 vehicle. You compare, is this compared to a 2010 vehicle, as I understand?
The fuel savings is my understanding is that relates to the savings that would accrue over the lifetime of the use of that vehicle, and that would be on the basis of a 2025 vehicle.
Okay. And on the lifetime, can you define lifetime for me?
It's about, I'm trying
All right.
to understand.
Well,
It's about
maybe this
15
will,
years.
I'll
About
lead
15
you
years.
then and see if you agree. To realize the $8,000 in fuel savings, a new car owner in 2025 has to drive 211,000 miles, and a truck owner has to drive 249,000 miles to achieve the $8,000 in savings. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
Then in my 8 seconds left, so if you own a Ford 150, which is the dominant vehicle in Nebraska, unless you drive 250,000 miles, you don't get the 8,000 fuel savings. But how many Americans today are driving their light trucks 250,000 in that lifetime?
The only thing I would suggest, sir, is that the added increase in costs that we projected when we proposed the rule was about $2,000 per vehicle. And so the 8,000 really is on balance to that 2,000. So we would project that the lifetime of that vehicle, you'd have between 5,200 and 6,600 in fuel savings. That would be over the lifetime of the one person who held it a long time, or two, or
Okay.
three. But it all depends on how you value gasoline, what you think the price of gasoline is going to be, and we did the best we could to project those figures appropriately.
All right, yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McCarthy, first of all, thank you for always being here and again working with us on a number of issues. And I have to admit, you don't always tell us yes, but at least we can see what we can do to work it out. With the D.C. District Court unanimously affirming the EPA's right to regulate carbon in the absence of Congress passing carbon control legislation, we must turn to ensuring that EPA GHG regulations do not put our energy-intensive industries in economic jeopardy. When do you expect the Tier 3 gasoline standards to be released?
Congressman, the Tier 3 standard is still a rule under development. I don't have any particular time frame for that at this point, but we would fully expect that when that rule is released, it will go through a robust public comment process, and we'll see where we end up.
Well, and I'm sure you know our committee in the House passed a bill last week dealing with a number of things, and I do have concern with giving time for industry to be able to, like 2 years or so, because they can do it. And you know the district I represent,
Yes.
5 refineries and tons of chemical plants.
Well, Congressman, we always have quite a significant lead time on when any rulemaking is finalized. I think I was trying to indicate that we're in the development stage right now. It'll take a while to move a bill forward, rule forward, and then we'll have significant lead time. And in the meantime, we'll be working with the industry on what's reasonable and appropriate to propose.
Okay. The next question is, when do you expect carbon standards for refineries?
Oh, that also is something that we're talking to the litigants about. The administrator made it very clear that the focus of attention for the agency right now is on new power plants.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that on power plants, and hopefully that would apply to refining capacity too, so we wouldn't have to go remake something that's, been added onto for years. As you know, I'm concerned about the possibility of both these regulations being issued around the same time, and on one hand asking refineries to actually increase their carbon output by requiring them to lower the sulfur content of gas, and then on the other hand you're going to ask them to reduce their carbon output below what's occurred under current Tier 2 sulfur standards. I would hope those, even though those two are different rules, that you would look at the impact of them and how long you have the ability to comply with both of them.
We certainly will. We did that with Tier 2 to understand what the permitting challenges were, what the pollutants might be in terms of increases or decreases. We will certainly do the same here.
Okay. And are you actively in conversations with the refining section on both these issues?
We are.
In February, EPA proposed to increase the availability of mechanisms to streamline permitting for greenhouse gas sources. And can you talk about these a little bit? Of course, I'm coming from Texas. I'm a little, since Texas refused to issue greenhouse gas permits, we have to ask the EPA to do that. And I've heard a couple of plants in Texas are having trouble receiving these type permits. I don't know if this is because of administrative changes in Region 6, but hopefully I'll follow up with you separately if you have a comment on if I were a refinery who, in fact, one I heard about yesterday is not in our district, but it's in North Texas, if they needed a carbon or greenhouse permit, it would come from the EPA.
It would in Texas, yes. That's beginning to be very unusual at this point, which is good. Most of the states have stepped up and are actually doing the permitting themselves. In fact, we've had about 44 permits issued. The vast majority of those have been by states and local local governments. And we're working with Texas. I think it's been the permitting side has been a pretty significant success story.
Okay.
We have been issuing those permits in the timeline under the Clean Air Act, which is 12 months after application. In Texas, we've had some difficulty in getting the information we need to process those permits.
Okay.
We're continuing to work with the regulated community to try to get that information so that we can get those permits out.
Have there actually been GHG or permits issued in Texas by EPA?
I'm not sure of that. I will get
If you'd get back with me.
Congressman, yes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my 18 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
And I thank the chairman for the recognition. I appreciate Ms. McCarthy being here with us again. We've had several mornings like this. Let me just ask, I mean, there have been other mornings when you've come before our committee, and we're grateful for those episodes. I've submitted several questions in writing for the record and am still awaiting responses to those questions from other hearings that we have, and I'm going to be submitting some additional questions for the record today. I just wonder if I might expect to get an answer to those questions that I'll be submitting today, as I haven't received answers from any of the other questions that have been submitted.
Congressman, I'm happy to work with your staff and see if we have missed an opportunity to respond in a timely way. I'll take care of that, and any questions you ask, we'll be sure to respond as quickly as we can.
Well, just to refresh your memory, one of the questions was on the disposal of over-the-counter asthma medications that contain CFCs, and what was the EPA's, what was their recommendation to manufacturers for the disposal of those asthma medications, since we apparently can't grant a waiver to allow those to be utilized by patients. Is the disposal of the asthma medication that it's going to have to be destroyed, is the disposal going to be handled in a way that will prevent the CFCs from entering the environment, since apparently one of the thrusts of the EPA has been their concern that asthmatics in this country are widening the hole in the ozone with every puff of a medication. But again, I do have some questions for the record, Mr. Chairman. I will be submitting those. I just would ask, in light of your answer, Mr. Green just, in response to a question from Mr. Green, you said that there would be, he asked if there would be new standards coming for power plants and refineries, and I believe you indicated that there would be.
What I indicated is that we have proposed standards for new power plants, and we are in discussions in the refinery world because we announced early on that we are using a common sense approach of looking at the largest sources first, but the administrator has made it very clear that we are not on a particular timeline at this point on refineries. We are focused on new sources for power plants.
Along those lines, are you going to be looking at the alternative natural gas production from the shale formations? Are you going to be looking at those activities as a source of greenhouse gas production?
At this point, the agency issued a regulation that looks at driving down volatile organic compounds from oil and gas, in particular from those wells that use hydraulic fracturing, which is the vast majority of new wells. We have found a way to reduce volatile organic compounds that also significantly reduces methane emissions, which is the significant greenhouse gas that's emitted in the oil and gas production sector. So at this point, the agency has no plans to do anything further on oil and gas, but as always, we can be petitioned to take a look at these issues, and there are many sectors where we have received petitions, but we're very clear. We are looking at new sources for power plants. We are in discussions on refineries, but we're quite a ways away. And any other sector, we will be working with the litigants in the courts to make sure that we can continue to address the largest sources first.
Well, you may understand that some of us are concerned about the fact that things tend to get larger than the original intention. And we're at a place where our economy is, depending upon who you read, is either continuing to struggle to try to recover or is in a very weak recovery mode. My concern in my part of the world is that if this is not done carefully, it certainly could have a very negative impact on the economy, certainly in North Texas, We want these products to be developed safely. We want public safety to always be at the forefront, but at the same time, historically, some of the activities have seemed to be an overreach, and as a consequence, the economic disruption could be significant. What I'm hearing you say today is right now, there is no plan to do that until you change your mind. Is that correct?
Well, I would say that we've sent some very clear signals on how we're being as deliberate as the law allows. We also have proposed a step 3 in the tailoring rule, which maintains the same level that we've had before. And the next step there is to take a look at what streamlining opportunities are available to us before we need to consider additional step down. So we are doing everything we can to actually reduce necessary carbon pollution, reduce that as much as possible, but do it in a way that's very deliberate and makes common sense and takes advantage of the cost efficiencies that various strategies to reduce carbon can actually accrue.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to submit the questions for the record and ask that they be included in the usual and customary timeline for response.
Absolutely. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. It gives us an opportunity, I believe, to discuss some good news when it comes to greenhouse gases and saving consumers money. And that has to do with the progress that we're making when it comes to more fuel-efficient vehicles and money back into the pockets of consumers at a very critical time. The good news is this doesn't really happen by accident, and I give President Obama and the EPA a lot of credit for pushing all of us and industry, everyone involved, to make greater progress. And a lot of my colleagues here have been at the forefront of that, and my hat's off to them too, because now we're seeing real results. We're going to reduce the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere and greenhouse gases, but save consumers money. And now you can see that consumers are embracing these more fuel-efficient vehicles because they're working better, they have greater pickup, the styles are much more interesting for folks, and they like to save money. They don't want to stop at the gas station, and it's really been a great success story. And I noticed that last week, my Republican colleagues held a hearing to receive testimony from various industry sectors about EPA's current and pending future greenhouse gas regulations. Noticeably absent from that hearing was any discussion of the successes that we're having when it comes to fuel efficiency and the EPA's initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles. You know, in the past, industry has been outspoken. They weren't sure that we could improve cars, that consumers in America would embrace more fuel-efficient vehicles, even while we watched other countries around the world advance beyond American industry. Well, that's not the case anymore. This has been a great success for American families and businesses, and Ms. McCarthy, the administration, and your shop deserves great credit for that. In April 2010, the administration finalized fuel efficiency and greenhouse gas standards for the model years 2012 to 2016. These standards will save consumers, on average, more than $3,000 in fuel costs over the life of a new vehicle. $3,000. This is the net savings after accounting for any increased vehicle costs. And I heard what my colleague, Mr. Terry, was saying. Gosh, these cars, right now, sometimes they're a little more expensive. If you go out, yeah, it's, I know this from family experience. Sometimes they're going to cost a little more. But if you do the math, you're going to save. And it's not that you're not going to achieve savings right away, because you're going to bypass that gas station, and that's money right into your pocket. In fact, I have some notes here. EPA and DOT estimate that the standard yields net savings of roughly $130 to $180 per year for consumers with a 5-year automobile loan. That's real money. And this is because the savings on fuel consumption costs substantially outweigh slightly higher loan payments for the vehicles. EPA projects that on average, consumers will save that $3,000 net over the life of the vehicle. So, Ms. McCarthy, would you talk a little bit more about the money back into the pockets of consumers, and then how the tailpipe standards help shield consumers from price spikes that we've seen recently at the gasoline pump?
Well, I think one of the most exciting things for us in terms of the light-duty vehicle rule is the broad support that rule actually enjoys. That's everybody from the car companies themselves who signed on and even asked us to do more, which is why we're looking at 2017 to 2025. First time we've had a national clean car program where we have totally aligned with every state in the country. We also have enjoyed the support of the United Auto Workers. So it's putting people back to work. It's building the kind of fuel-efficient vehicles that consumers want to buy. And we have not only identified the cost savings to consumers at the pump and explained to them that they will also perhaps not have to go to gas stations as much, which is a benefit I particularly like. But we've also explained to them that it is an energy security issue. It allows us to actually reduce our dependence on foreign oil, and it actually significantly reduces greenhouse gases. So I guess the good thing about taking a look at greenhouse gases, which really have to be reduced for public health and welfare, also provides tremendous opportunities for looking at increased efficiency, which almost always saves people money.
Yeah, and in addition to the consumer savings, I mean, we're talking about greenhouse gases. This program will save 1.8 billion barrels of oil and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the U.S. vehicle fleet by 21% compared to projected emissions without the standards. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Gentlelady's time is expiring. This time, I recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Ms. McCarthy. Thanks for coming today. I wanted to clarify something you said in your opening statement about the tailoring rule and what the court said about the tailoring rule. If I understood the opinion correctly, all they said was that this particular plaintiff did not have standing. They did not approve the tailoring rule as statutorily authorized. Is that correct?
They did not speak to the substance of the rule.
Right, so they simply said you found the wrong plaintiff to walk in the door. We have made no statement about the appropriateness or the legality of the tailoring rule under the Clean Air Act. Is that correct?
Their decision was that the litigants did not have standing in the case, and they dismissed the claim.
Great, thanks. I'm not sure that's exactly what you said in your opening statement, so I wanted to clarify it. Thank you. In February, you testified in front of the subcommittee when I asked you if you'd received guarantees from companies supplying pollution control technology under the Utility MACT rule. You said you had not, and you would look into it. I asked you again in May a very similar question. You said you were reviewing reconsideration petitions that were related to this, specifically one by the Institute of Clean Air Companies, which had asked for partial reconsideration of the Utility MACT rule. Are you still looking at this? You're still reviewing this set of issues?
Yes, we are.
Fast forward to today, where we're talking about the greenhouse gas new source performance standards. You have testimony that says that new coal-based units can use carbon capture CCS technology to comply with GHG emissions. You suggest EPA as being reasonable because you're offering a 30-year averaging. The text of the proposed rule talks about this 30-year proposed averaging. I want to come back to that. But the rule makes it abundantly clear that CCS is nowhere near ready for mass-scale deployment. And yet your own rule states that the technology would be jump-started by the rule itself. Do you have any commitment from any supplier that they can produce a coal-fired power plant that would comply with these rules?
I have not sought such a commitment.
Any reason that we would create a set of rules that we have no evidence that anybody can actually build one of these creatures in the real world, right? Real people, real mechanics, real plumbers, real pipe fitters, real human beings actually constructing a full-scale, economically viable coal-fired power plant under this set of rules?
Well, we have been relying on the information on the activity that's gone on and the technical feasibility of each of the steps necessary for carbon capture and sequestration, the actual capture, the transportation, and the storage. Each of those steps is well proven. There are pilots that are demonstrating those at commercial scale, and there are a number of power plants that are coal-fired that are proposing to be constructed using CCS today. I think we attempted to establish a standard which gave the flexibility for new power plants to be proposed with coal that actually wouldn't make a commitment to CCS for over the course of as much as 10 years and still be able to achieve the standard in the law, in the rule, sorry.
I appreciate that. Do you believe that if somebody's out trying to finance one of these plants, when the technology doesn't exist, that there is an entity in the world that would possibly commit the capital to build one of these when they have no idea what the risk is, if in fact their technology doesn't pan out, as so often is the case?
There are coal-fired power plants being proposed today and permitted that are proposing to use CCS, and I have to assume that they are doing their due diligence for their financing.
What happens, what are the penalties if they get to year 13 and they don't, it becomes very clear they can't make the 30-year option, that it's not going to work?
I think EPA will be working with these companies over what the strategy is and the permitting associated with achieving compliance. We'll do what we always do, which is to work with the company and look at what a compliance strategy might look like.
Could they be shut down if it turns out in year 13 it's not working? Could the remedy be that if the CCS technology doesn't comply, that the EPA could come in and shut this plant down in its entirety after 12 years of operation?
I believe it's a 30-year averaging, so I do not believe that that's a likely scenario, no.
So at 26 years, if they're not making it, and it just everybody stares at it, and we all do the math, and there's just you can't get there from here.
The way that the regulation proposes is to establish a plan with the company, and if they miss any of the benchmarks towards a 30-year averaging strategy, that they'll have to come in and look at how we would adjust that permit and establish a compliance strategy.
But if they can't, you could shut them down, and you might.
Well, it's true of any company that doesn't meet the compliance obligations, but it very seldom has happened.
Certainly, and I appreciate that. It's just very different when you're not talking about existing technologies, when you're talking about a technological advance that has yet to be demonstrated to make a bet that you can get there. Thank you for your testimony. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the past 18 months, we've heard repeated claims that EPA's actions on greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act were not authorized by law and would cause calamitous effects. I'd like to revisit some of these claims now that the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals has ruled decisively in EPA's favor. During part one of this hearing held last Tuesday, we heard witnesses and members of this committee describe EPA's actions to reduce greenhouse gases as magical thinking and regulatory overreach. In previous hearings, members of this committee have claimed that EPA is acting without legal authority in regulating greenhouse gases. The D.C. Circuit appears to have settled that debate. Ms. McCarthy, how does the court's decision compare with claims of EPA's regulatory overreach?
The court indicated that we were unambiguously correct in our interpretation of what is required under the Clean Air Act, and we have complied with that.
Over the past 18 months, this subcommittee also has heard many non-scientists opine about the scientific basis of EPA's greenhouse gas regulations. At least 12 Republican members of the Energy and Commerce Committee have made public statements questioning or rejecting the scientific consensus on climate change. Others have argued that a few phrases taken out of context from hacked emails reveal a conspiracy of bad science. Ms. McCarthy, what did the court have to say about the adequacy of the scientific record that EPA relied upon to find that greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare?
The court found that the body of scientific evidence that EPA had marshaled to make its endangerment finding was substantial. It looked at the petitions for reconsideration of that science, and it found that it was filled with mischaracterizations, misrepresentations, not looking at the 18,000 peer-reviewed studies that provided the foundation for that endangerment finding, and it seemed to be a clear statement that EPA had done its job on the science is supposed to be done.
At the hearing last week, we heard dire predictions about the effect of regulating carbon pollution under the Clean Air Act. We heard that EPA's rules would place a dramatic economic burden on farms and that huge pollution control investments would be required for bakeries. The Farm Bureau even warned that Americans are, quote, going to be living off imported food, end quote. All of these predictions were premised on the assumption that the court would overturn the tailoring rule, which EPA issued precisely to avoid unintended adverse consequences. But the court found that none of the industry and state petitioners had standing to challenge the tailoring rule because they failed to establish that the rule caused them any injury or that overturning it would redress any injury they had suffered. Ms. McCarthy, now that the tailoring rule remains in effect, can you explain the greenhouse permitting requirements that apply to farmers and ranchers?
There are no permitting requirements associated with farmers and ranchers.
How about bakeries and other small sources? Are they subject to greenhouse gas permitting requirements under the Clean Air Act?
No, they are not at this point, no.
That's because the tailoring rule ensures that only the largest sources of greenhouse gases are currently subject to permitting requirements.
That is correct, and that's where we intend to focus all of our attention, yes.
Others have expressed concerns that EPA plans to change the tailoring rule thresholds to require permitting for much smaller sources. Ms. McCarthy, could you speak to these concerns?
Yes, the administrator has indicated that in no circumstances is she going to be looking at lowering the tailoring rule to small sources. We also have an obligation to do a 5-year review, at which time we're going to propose streamlining opportunities. And we have a full work group looking at those opportunities at this point. In our most recent Step 3 proposal, we are proposing to maintain the same level, high level of emissions so that we continue to capture only the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you. Coal and natural gas are both fuels used to generate electricity. They're market competitors. What my Republican colleagues appear to want is for EPA to treat coal differently than other fuels, particularly natural gas. They want EPA to give coal a pass for the pollution it generates when burned. Ms. McCarthy, do the proposed carbon pollution standards set a more stringent standard for coal, or do they set the same standard for all fossil fuel-fired electricity generation and let the fuels compete on a level playing field?
They set the same standard, one standard.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes at this time the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are a series of questions I'd like to address, primarily brought about by some of the comments made by the opposition, but also by your comments about you don't think there's been any change. It's been market-driven of why companies are using gas rather than coal. And I want to remind you back, we had a hearing last year when gas prices were $7 or $8 an MCF. But Purdue University say they were switching from coal to gas because of the EPA regulation threatening to make the byproduct a hazardous material. So it had nothing to do with the price of coal or gas. It was the threat of the EPA causing a stigma attached to that product. But I want to go, so I know that it's not all founded, and I do appreciate your patience because you've been here how many times, and we've had some interesting, but I want to follow back up on what Dr. Bird just asked you. I've asked you too for some letters. I don't know whether it's I don't want to say it's a conspiracy, but I don't understand why you're not answering our letters or answering questions that you say you're going to get back to us about. I asked you last year. Explain to me, in all this discussion of greenhouse gases and global warming, I want you to tell me why the Milankovitch, the physicist Milankovitch, and his Milankovitch cycle has been, in your mind, discredited. I'd further like to understand why Hal Lewis and his resignation from the American Physical Society, where he says in his comment, if I can just call that up, He said, it is the greatest, the global warming scam is the greatest and most successful pseudo-scientific fraud I've seen in my long life as a physicist. This is not a politician saying this is a scientist. This is someone that is the emeritus professor at University of California, Santa Barbara. And he and 200 other people have signed off on this issue. And I've asked for you all to tell me, as an engineer myself, explain to me why that's not valid to be part of this discussion. And we still don't hear back. Can you get back to us again, a third, fourth time we've asked for that? Will you do that, please?
Congressman, if you've written a letter to me, I will certainly answer it. But I
Not
think
only we've written letters,
EPA's
but we've
job
asked
is-
you in testimony here to get back, and you're very kind. You say you'll do it, and then, like so many other folks here, they just get lost somehow, perhaps. But I want to go back to where you say you don't think this has affected the coal fields in this country, when in 1993 the EPA itself said the byproduct of burning coal was not a hazardous material. It should be recycled. In 2000, they came out and said the same thing. But yet again, the EPA under new administration picks that fight back up again after it's been disproved twice, and is making this threat that the byproduct of burning coal could be a hazardous material. How much more studies are we going to have? It's that kind of uncertainty that's coming out of your office that's causing plants, coal company, or utility companies to maybe just pull back like they did at Purdue University. How do you respond? Do you really think we need do we need to have another study?
Well, I think people have asked us when EPA proposed its coal ash rule to take a very close look at the science, to take a very close look at the
Has the
options
science
and how it
changed since
applies
'93 and 2000?
Well,
It's the
I'm
same
sorry,
compound.
I can speak for the science that relate to air pollution, and clearly the science gets more sophisticated every day. It gets better every day. The clarity and the substance and the robustness of the data, particularly on issues of climate, it gets clearer
let me
and
just
clearer
regain
all
my
the
time. I've only got 18 seconds to go, and I know we got. Let me invite again anyone from the EPA to please come with us to the coal fields across America and talk to the miners and their families when they talk about that. When it is suggested that it's the price of gas that's costing them their jobs, when 700 people at Arch Coal get let go, we've got to be more sensitive to the middle class people across this country, and particularly those that have mined coal that have made America what it is. So let me extend that invitation again to you. I did it to Lisa Jackson last year. She ignored that. Let me ask you again. Please come and talk to these people and explain to them how there's a future for their industry.
Thank
You do that?
Gentleman's
very
time's
much.
expired. At this time, let me just say we have a couple of votes on the House floor. We've got about 9 minutes remaining, so I'm hoping to get at least 2 more members to ask questions. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. On Wednesday, Rex Tillerson, the head of ExxonMobil, said that he agreed that global warming is real and man-made. Big moment. And he said that we should just adapt to its effects. And adaptation is possible for certain segments of the population, but for many, it's not possible. I mean, obviously out in Colorado right now, 30,000 people have just been evacuated. So that's their adaptation to, you know, those forest fires and to this historic drought out there. And for people who live on Cape Cod whose homes might be ultimately just swept away, their adaptation will be to move to Worcester or Springfield or someplace just to get away from the coastline, if that's what adaptation means, which is obviously the case. So does it make sense right now, Ms. McCarthy, to reduce global warming pollution instead of just trying to adapt later, when the human and economic toll of global warming becomes catastrophic? Let's just say, for example, that the Waxman-Markey bill, which passed just 3 years ago on Tuesday, it's its 3rd anniversary of passing the House of Representatives, if it had passed the Senate as well, would we be well on our way now to reducing the totality of greenhouse gases in our society and putting the planet on a pathway towards an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases?
Congressman, I would agree with you that we need to take action now, and it's not just me, but it's the U.S. National Research Council who made that point very recently.
Now, earlier this week, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals issued a complete and total repudiation of several lawsuits that sought to overturn EPA's regulation of global warming pollution under the Clean Air Act. The court said that EPA's finding that global warming is dangerous was neither arbitrary nor capricious, and that EPA's reading of the Clean Air Act was unambiguously correct. The court found that EPA's scientific evidence of record included support for the proposition that greenhouse gases trap heat on Earth that would otherwise dissipate into space, and that this greenhouse effect warms the climate, that human activity is contributing to increased atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases, and that the climate system is warming. Do you agree with that court's conclusion?
Yes, I do.
And do you also agree that the scientific data has supported this conclusion for a long time?
Yes, I do. I think it's much stronger now than it has been, but yes.
Now, it is worth remembering that it was in 2003 that EPA was first sued for failing to use its Clean Air Act authority to curb global warming pollution. That lawsuit culminated in the very famous Massachusetts versus EPA decision, which directed the Bush administration to cease its unlawful refusal to even ask the question of whether global warming pollution was dangerous. This set in motion the Bush administration, EPA's scientific finding that yes, global warming is dangerous. That was the Bush administration. Found that yes, it was dangerous, and the Bush White House refusal to accept this EPA determination, and the Obama administration's subsequent affirmation of this science followed. It is also worth reminding everyone here that with the help of your strong leadership under 4 governors, Ms. McCarthy, Massachusetts has been at the forefront of combating the effects of global warming pollution. During Governor Romney's tenure, his administration implemented a long-term vision for cutting the state's global warming pollution by funding renewable energy and playing a key role in efforts to develop a regional northeastern cap-and-trade system. And I congratulated Governor Romney for creating that cap-and-trade system, and I just want to do so again. I think he was a visionary in that way, in the same way he was with the health care plan that was the model for the national plan that the Supreme Court upheld yesterday. And Governor Romney, on both cap-and-trade and on health care, was and continues to be a real model for the rest of the country to follow. And we just hope that, you know, the Republicans continue to have him as their leader and follow his inspirational leadership in those 2 areas. Indeed, in July 2003 letter from Governor Romney to Governor Pataki on the topic, he said, quote, "Climate change is beginning to have an effect on our natural resources," and he described the need to take steps to reduce the, quote, "power plant pollution that is harming our climate." So the science underpinning global warming is nothing new, even if Governor Romney seems to have forgotten what he believed and what he did 9 years ago. The widespread acceptance of this science is nothing new. EPA's authority to act is nothing new. The recognition that the effects of global warming are happening with increasing intensity is nothing new. Regrettably, this subcommittee continues to have hearings that deny that which everyone knows in the scientific community, with a very small number of exceptions, to be true. And I thank the gentleman.
Thank you,
for
Mr.
this.
Markey. We'll inform Mr. Romney that you'll probably be voting for him. And this time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCarthy, it's good to have you back before the subcommittee. We always appreciate your candor and your being here. I hear from people about the agency that they submit things and you all don't keep track of it. We heard from my colleague, Mr. McKinley, about letters that allegedly, apparently, gone unanswered. Does EPA even bother to track or characterize like notices of intent to sue the agency?
Yes,
Or-
we do.
You do? So when they come in, what happens? Like when they come in, like they're going to sue your part of the agency, what happens? Do you characterize those? Do you look at them? Do you track them? How do you manage that?
In a way that a business would manage that. We have an office that manages that at General Counsel. We track those. We provide information to all the relevant individuals, and we meet our obligations under the law.
So you compile them, you format them, I mean, you just, they don't go off into some wasteland and you don't know what to do with them.
No, they do not.
Because when Administrator Jackson testified before our committee on February 28th regarding the budget, she said the EPA would post on its website petitions for rulemaking and notices of intent to sue. And then recently, EPA wrote to the committee, including myself, and said that you don't have the adequate resources to make that information publicly available. And further said EPA doesn't currently have a centralized process to collect, categorize, and sort all the petitions for rulemaking that the agency receives. And they say the same thing when it comes to intent to sue. Now, you've just told me you do keep track of that. It's in the council's office. So which is it?
You asked me about notices of intent to sue.
Right.
I receive those notices when they come in and they are tracked. I don't get notices of all petitions that might come in relative to rulemaking.
But you do on
certainly aware of
intents
my
to
own.
sue. Okay, good. Because what the response back to us from the administrators are.
Sorry, I've been reminded that the ones I get actually relate to my own business. The EPA program. I do not track everything going through the agency.
No, but I understand that. Does he want to testify? Just curious.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I've been reminded that when I say notices of intent, I'm thinking of those that actually lead to a suit, not just every notice of intent that the agency was given. So I'm sorry if I've given you incorrect information, Congressman. I'll do better.
Well, good, because that's the heart of the matter. It seemed like a pretty simple request to say, could you put those notices of intent up for the public to see?
Apparently, we get a whole lot that never reaches my level and a whole lot that never comes to fruition.
How about the ones that...
And we'll certainly, I'll certainly make sure that I don't misspeak in the future.
No, well, let's go to the heart of the matter here. What about the ones that go to your level? Since they're categorized, they're compiled, you know what they are? Can you put those up so the public knows?
We'll certainly go back. I'll talk to the Office of General Counsel. Those are given to me as advisories. I don't know whether they are, again, complete in terms of what the agency receives.
Look, here's the real issue that I think the American public, a lot of my constituents are frustrated about. All too often, you get what's called a friendly lawsuit or a friendly intent to sue. Now, I've never thought any lawsuit was very friendly, but you get an intent to sue, and then an agency is able then to settle that lawsuit sort of out of any transparent environment. People don't even know that somebody filed an intent to sue, and all we're thinking is it'd be better to have some transparency and accountability in your operation. And I'm getting really confused signals between what you said and your counsel behind you said and what the administrator said, and I don't think any of the answers are adequate for what I want, what many members on this committee seek, and what should be simple. If somebody says they are going to sue your agency to compel a rulemaking or something of that nature, I just don't understand if it gets to you why you can't make that public. If the EPA's Office of General Counsel doesn't track that information, at least what you track, can you put up on the website?
Well, I guess the one thing we can agree on is that I don't think of any lawsuit as friendly either. So
you don't agree with me on the transparency need or the accountability need?
We work very hard at transparency. I do
Wouldn't it be simple to...
I do not believe that I can make a commitment one way or another. If the administrator has raised this issue, I'm sure we're looking at it as closely as we can.
No, they came back to us in a letter and said you can't do it. It's too complicated, too burdensome, you don't have the resources, you don't compile, you don't characterize. It's just impossible to do. That's really not an adequate response from my perspective, because I think this is important information. It often leads to a resolution that is out of the view of the public till it's done. People don't have an adequate way to participate in something that can be very meaningful to them, and I'm just not, I don't get it. I guess you
Well,
want to
my
keep this stuff
understanding is that
undercover
we're-
and hidden away, and I don't know, it's bad government.
My
That-
understanding is that we've provided extensive information to the committee, and we're certainly indicated when we have been sued over.
I've got the response right here from Administrator
Yep.
Jackson where they say you don't have the ability to do this. And I-
Gentleman's time has expired, and we have, time has expired on the first vote, so we're going to try to get over there and get that, and then we have a second vote. So as soon as this is over, which it is, we'll vote on the second. We'll be right back, so we should be back within 15 minutes. And if you wouldn't mind waiting, then, Ms.
course not.
McCarthy, we'd appreciate it. And so we'll recess for a period of 15 minutes, and we'll be right back. Okay. We'll reconvene the hearing and apologize once again for the slight delay. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here, and I do appreciate the fact that you're willing to come and speak with us on a fairly regular basis. In your testimony, you stated that as of June 10 of this year, several dozen large industrial sources of greenhouse gases, such as cement plants, power plants, refineries, and steel mills, had received permits for greenhouse gases under these programs, PSD and Title V. How many is several dozen?
Pardon me?
How many is several dozen? Are we talking about just 24, or is that,
Hang on
or is
one
there
second,
some other
I'll tell
number?
you. 44 permits with greenhouse gas limits have been issued, 37 by the states and 7 by EPA. And 29 permits are pending at EPA.
All right, and are those permits final, or are some subject to appeal?
The 44 permits would be final permits. I do not have knowledge of whether or not they have been appealed.
All right. And how many permit applications are pending or waiting to be processed?
29 with EPA.
There are 29 pending with EPA?
Eight pending permits, draft permits issued by the state. We have 29 permits pending at EPA. 24 of them are greenhouse gas only. That's where the states do the rest of the permitting. And 5 of them are for the full suite of pollutants that need to be permitted through our PSD program.
And how long does it take to process an application?
The requirements in the law ask us to complete the permit within 12 months of a completed permit application. So that is the goal here, and for the most part, we have achieved that goal.
So you're saying it's 12 months, because my understanding is at a field hearing in response to a question for the record following your testimony last year in Texas, the committee asked how long would it take to process a PSD permit, and my understanding was that at that time you indicated it would be made in a few weeks for most projects. And so you're telling me now it's taking somewhere close to a year?
The requirement under the Clean Air Act is for EPA to expeditiously process them. They recognize a 12-month window between a completed application and issuing the permit. For greenhouse gases, we have in some ways beaten that and done it more quickly. Other times, it takes a while for a completed application, and then we have completed it within that 12-month period.
Yes, ma'am. You know, one of my concerns, I'm switching gears on you. One of my concerns when I hear the testimony, and it's not new with you, or it's not exclusive to party either, is that sometimes people from more affluent areas don't understand what's going on in a district like mine, which compared to the rest of the country is not that affluent. $36,000 is, I believe, the latest census data on the household income. And so when we have new regulations, you know, no matter how well-intentioned and how much they might save somebody money, when you add $1,000 more to the cost of a car by 2016 and a total of $3,000 more by 2025, you're basically saying that a lot of folks in my district won't ever be able to afford to buy a new car. In fact, the National Auto Dealers Association says upwards of 6 million people won't be able to afford a new car because of these costs. And you know, it's just sometimes when I hear folks talking about the cost of electricity, when your boss, Lisa Jackson, was in here and I asked her what happens when people can't afford to heat their homes, she indicated there's a program for that, but my people back home tell me that in the cold winter, the program runs out of money about mid-February and people are cold. And I'm just wondering why we don't have, or at least not have the appearance that the EPA is paying attention to some of these numbers, that unemployment does happen. In my district, we have 2 coal-fired power plants that are going to be shut down. One of them is going to be retrofitted and partially reopened with natural gas. And of course, I also hear from my folks who make electricity, and one of them no longer works in the industry. He says, we've been through this before where natural gas prices go down and everybody thinks that's going to be our savior. And inevitably, we always have to turn back to coal. And so you're looking at a lot of different health factors, people not being able to heat their homes properly. We heard a testimony in a different hearing yesterday that unemployment is a major factor in determining whether or not people are healthy. And yet it does not appear that when the EPA is studying these regulations that they look at, so what happens in the poorer regions where they can't afford the electricity or they can't afford a new car, or it's going to create large pockets of unemployment in the region. We lost 1,100 jobs in coal in the region, not in my district, but in the region in just the last few weeks. And, you know, it just amazes me sometimes that there seems to be a disconnect with Washington and with more affluent areas of the country who don't understand that they truly are relegating the people that I represent to a lower lifestyle, a lower health quality standard. And, you know, I don't think it's intentional, but it sure is real. And I appreciate that, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator McCarthy, for being here today. And to follow up a little bit on the questions from my colleague from Virginia, you mentioned the word disproportionate risk in your statement. Is there a disproportionate burden on poor when it comes to the rising cost of energy?
I would assume that, I'm sorry, I don't necessarily understand.
Is there a disproportionate burden on the
Clearly,
poor?
every dollar matters more to somebody who has less dollars than others.
So it's a disproportionate share, a disproportionate burden on poor when energy prices rise.
It's certainly a more significant challenge, I would assume.
So a disproportionate
Just
burden.
being a person.
Right? I mean, you'd say yes to that? Disproportionate burden?
In my personal opinion, yes.
Okay, thank you. In your testimony, you stated that the EPA has proceeded to begin limiting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas pollution from the largest emitting categories of mobile and stationary sources. EPA said that absent the tailoring rule, 82,000 sources would need PSD permits annually, and over 6 million sources would need operating permits. Does the EPA believe it has the legal authority to regulate all these sources?
The legal authority to regulate, yes.
Okay, yes, the answer is yes. Will EPA be expanding the number of sources in future years?
It will depend upon the assessment we make, and we'll do a report on that, and we'll see what we can do and what streamlining opportunities there are.
So the answer could be yes? It might expand?
I would not want to presume what we're going to do in the future. I know what we are doing now and in the record that
But the answer is not no.
It's not no, correct.
Okay. There are more than 70 source categories and subcategories regulated under the NSPS program. Are the over 70 sources categories all potentially subject to greenhouse gas NSPS standards?
Are they potentially?
Yes.
Yes.
So they are all potentially, all 70 sources are potentially, okay. And then the other question I have for you is back in 2008, EPA published a notice that listed numerous source categories that could be subject to greenhouse gas regulation under the Clean Air Act in the Federal Register. Besides utilities and refineries, there was a very long list. Are there any of these sources that you would exempt from regulation? Utility boilers.
We make individual case judgments on where the sources of pollution
So
are, the risks they pose, the technologies available, and whether or not NSPS is a good tool.
So you wouldn't exempt that? Ships, ocean-going vessels, aircraft and aircraft engines?
We're addressing those issues through litigation
Locomotives.
as well as other responses.
Locomotives, non-road vehicles. What about non-road vehicles?
I haven't made that judgment, and we haven't made that scientific or
Motorcycles?
technological assessment. Haven't made that assessment.
Dirt bikes? Snowmobiles? Any of those that you would exempt?
I'm not in a position to exempt or assess any of those at this point.
Marine engines? All-terrain vehicles, ATVs? Nothing?
I'm not going to make an assessment of that, and I'm not going to indicate what EPA's judgment might be in the future.
Okay, let me just read a few more of these.
I don't think you'd want me to do that.
Let me read a few more of these. Passenger buses, air conditioning, cooling systems, highway and non-road fuels, farm tractors, forklifts, harbor crafts, lawnmowers, string lawn trimmers. Would you exempt string lawn trimmers?
I'm not going to make any judgment about the future of EPA's action.
Portable power generators, handheld lawn care equipment, leaf blowers, trimmers, construction equipment, cement kilns, iron and steel production facilities, lime industry, chemical manufacturing, commercial buildings. These are all part of a long list. And the tailoring rule ratchets down. And so when you talk about the fact that, this tailoring rule, we don't know what's going to happen, that's the uncertainty that exists with businesses. That's the uncertainty that exists in the economy. And so you're saying you're not going to regulate it now, but we don't know what you're doing in the future. You say you can't do it now, but the tailoring rule ratchets down. And so things like lawnmowers, things like string lawn trimmers, maybe not today, but maybe down the road. That's what you're saying, correct?
I think we make judgments, and if you look at how EPA has applied the new source performance standards, it's on the basis of the amount of pollution, whether there are control strategies, whether or not the tool should be applied, and I think you're asking questions about sectors where those judgments haven't been made, but it's very clear the direction of this agency. We are going after the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, those that are heavily regulated sources, those where there's now uncertainty that carbon regulation and carbon interest has caused, and we're trying to address that uncertainty in a reasonable, common sense, phased approach. That's what we're doing.
So are you going to stop there? Is that it?
We have made a commitment in the tailoring rule at a 5-year window to take a look at whether or not the threshold should be lowered and the type of streamlining opportunities that would be available to the agency to address greenhouse gases.
So in
Regular order, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Sorry. This time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, for the recognition. Welcome, Administrator McCarthy. Thanks for coming today and give us your time and expertise. Most of my questions are going to focus on the Las Brisas Energy Center in Corpus Christi, Texas. This is a proposed 1,320 megawatt power generator, energy power generator that's doing it with petroleum coke, pet coke, which is a byproduct of the local refineries along the Gulf Coast and right there in the Corpus Christi area. This project is supposed to provide power for 850,000 homes. Construction will provide about 1,300 jobs, direct jobs, 2,600 indirect jobs, so about 4,000 jobs. And once it gets operating, it'll be about 100 direct jobs and 200 indirect jobs. So big economic impact in the Corpus Christi, Texas area, in Oasis County. It's important in Texas that we get this plant operating as soon as possible because ERCOT, our power regulator in our state, the grid manager, said that Texas will have a 2,500 megawatt shortfall by 2014. So just a little over 2 years, a 2,500 megawatt shortfall. That's 850,000 homes. We are at risk of brownouts and blackouts. So it's important that the Las Brisas Energy Center gets up online as soon as possible. The permit process has been going on for 3 years, and they got the final PSD, the Prevention of Significant Deterioration permit from the Texas Council on Environmental Quality just this past year. But these new greenhouse gas permitting, the new greenhouse gas permits, this rules have been issued after the TCQ got the permit, the PSD permit approved, may make them go through the whole permitting process again. Last year, 7 members of Congress, myself, wrote Administrator Jackson, and she asked Region 6 Administrator, former Regional 6 Administrator Al Armendariz, to respond. He wasn't a credible regulator. He had been retained before he became the Region 6 Administrator to testify against the Las Brisas Energy Center, and we're still waiting for an objective answer. So I have one request. Will you commit to giving me, persevering, and expediting the Las Brisas PSD permit?
I will commit that the agency in each of its regions has been committed to expediting these. I do know that permit application is under review by the region. I also know that we're waiting for information from Las Brisas at this point in order to complete that permit.
Can you give me that list of the information you have? Because I met with them yesterday, and they will get you anything you need like that. So please give me that information ASAP. I will get that information to you. They want this. We need to get this thing up and running as quickly as possible. My state is in a power shortage, a potential very dangerous crisis because we are the fastest growing state in the union. We've got this heat wave that the nation's being affected right now, but it's a very serious problem. We need to address this right now, and this power plant can do, again, 2,500 megawatts. Is with a shortfall we have 1,320. This power plant in and of itself will provide. And one more question about Las Brisas, a little clarification. It's about the new source performance standards for CO2. You know, in March, a couple months ago, EPA proposed new CO2 standards targeting fossil fuel power plants. Under the new standards, power plants would be subject to a maximum CO2 emissions rate of 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour, a rate that a new coal-fired power plant cannot meet without installing carbon capture technology, which doesn't even exist. This only applies, my question is, this only applies to new sources. So it would exempt power plants that have already begun the permitting process. Is that correct?
It would, as long as we have proposed a transitional category for those that have permits and can begin construction within a year.
Would Las Brisas be included in this transitional
Actually,
status?
they have petitioned us to take a look at that. I'm sure they've responded through comment, and we'll respond to that petition, and we'll take a look at it. We did actually solicit comment on this issue to make sure that we had the right facilities included in that transitional category, and to take comment on that 12-month window.
Okay, again, please expedite that process, because we need to get this power plant up and running as soon as possible. You know, Petco, because we got it all over the Gulf Coast there. If we don't use it to produce our power, guess what? We've got to send it overseas somewhere. We need that. That's American energy, American jobs. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlemen's time has almost expired, so thank you. Okay. Mr. Rush, do you have any additional questions or comments?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank again Ms. McCarthy for her outstanding testimony and for her the time that she has been here. She's waited for us, and so I just want to let her know how much we appreciate it. And Mr. Chairman, with that said, I do have a document I want to enter into the record. So I ask for unanimous consent that this report, Gearing Up Smart Standards Create Good Jobs, Building Cleaner Cars.
Without objection, so thank you, Mr. Rush. I just want to make one additional comment to follow up on Corey Gardner's line of questioning. I think that the concern here is that under the major source definition under the Clean Air Act, any emission of 250 tons, in some cases 100 tons, in other cases, you all have the responsibility to regulate. And so you issued the tailoring rule because of the demand it would take if you went down to that level would overwhelm the agency. But yet, legally, you do have a legal responsibility to go down to 250 or 100, whatever the case may be. And I think that was the point that Mr. Gardner was getting to, is that theoretically, if someone did bring a lawsuit and said you're violating the statute and you should be down at 250 instead of 100,000 or 75,000, that would be a clear violation of the clear statement of the law in the Clean Air Act. So I think that's where these farm groups and others are concerned, even though you're not at that point yet. But I also want to thank you very much for coming to be with us today. And I want to bring up just one other matter, which does not really relate to you personally as much as it does the Office of Congressional Affairs and Mr. Arvin Gannison and so forth. As you know, we've had a lot of hearings, and we're going to have a lot of hearings between now and when this session ends, and we don't have a lot of days left. And we've had some issues on attendance of witnesses in a number of hearings. I've got a long list of them here. Alternative Fuels hearing, we've tried 3 or 4 different times on Margot Ogie to try to get dates that she could come, and she couldn't come. She's changed them. She couldn't come. Finally, she's agreed to a date. On the RIN fraud case, because O&I is having hearings, we have some substantive issues that we want to explore on that, and we've had difficulty getting witnesses. On a field hearing that we're having relating to new source review, greenhouse gas, we are having difficulty getting hearing. And then Dr. Burgess referred to this primatine mist issue and methyl bromide issue, which all comes about as a result of the Montreal Protocol. We have been trying to get a hearing on that and have had great difficulty because Oversight and Investigation is doing a hearing. And you all have over 17,000 employees. You have a budget of $8.4 billion. And I hope that maybe you would talk to Mr. Gannison and some others. And I know we've had a lot of hearings. There's been a lot of demands, but we're going to continue to have hearings, and we do hope that you all will make every effort to, we've tried to accommodate you all too. It hasn't been a one-way street, but we really would appreciate you all making a concerted effort to get witnesses here. So that would conclude today's hearing. The record will remain open for 10 days. And once again, Ms. McCarthy, thank you for being with us today. And that'll conclude today's hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.